Hey guys, welcome to Local Relief Live. I am your host, Heather Hackett, and what we do here is really educate you on things that you need to know surrounding disasters. And today I am super excited about this guest because there's nobody knows more than this guy. So I actually saw Brock Long speak years ago, and to say it was engaging is an understatement. When he was speaking, nobody else was, and you will learn why. But he currently is the executive chairman for Hagerty Consulting and was the former FEMA administrator. You got it, for the country. And he has a 26-year career. He is, oh my gosh, he's legend. He's absolutely legend in the field. And I could not be more honored, Brock. Truly, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Heather. Heather, I appreciate it, and appreciate what you're trying to do too.
Ah, thank you. Now, as far as what you've done, because you have a massive career, the one thing I do want to talk about, because there is nobody that knows better than you, as far as I know FEMA's been in the news a lot, but also as far as FEMA goes, I think the more people talk about it, they almost even don't know what exactly they do. Can we just clarify
Yeah.
really quickly of what exactly FEMA does?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of misconceptions about FEMA's role and what it actually has the authorities to do, and what it's capable of. I think let's start all the way back. If I could have one conversation with anybody right now, if I could go back in history and do it, it'd be Jimmy Carter. President Carter. He was the one who basically, under his administration, created the concept of FEMA and disaster relief. And if you look back at some of the statements that he made, back in the day, it's like the nation needs a disaster relief mechanism to help people on their worst days. And I'm paraphrasing that. And but if you look back, in 1979, FEMA was pretty much born out of the Carter administration. And one of the worst disasters, one of the first disasters, I think it was the third disaster ever declared, was Mount St. Helens. The eruption in Mount St. Helens, which a lot of folks aren't really familiar with, and it was one of the first times that a FEMA mechanism started to provide disaster relief to victims and helping them out. And since that time, all the way up to today, FEMA has morphed into this massive, not massive, a large federal government agency with a mission that's even bigger than its size. And what I mean by that is people don't realize that FEMA watches over half the globe. Um, you've got Tinian and Saipan in the Western Pacific, all the way to the U.S. Virgin Islands, out in the Atlantic. So literally half the globe is FEMA's jurisdiction, and it's not just the 50 states; it's 16 island territories, and there is never a dull day. So when I went into the office, Heather, in 2017, I exited. I was there from 2017 to 19. And I would argue that it was one of the most complex times in emergency management history, in our nation's history. 2 months after I was Senate confirmed, 95-4. So I was never looked at as a politician. I only had 4 negative votes against me in my Senate confirmation. But we went through 220 disasters and wildfires, declared disasters and wildfires in 2 years. So that's one every 3 days, Heather. And that spanned across the globe. Literally, Hurricane U2, the strongest hurricane to ever impact the United States or territory, was Hurricane U2, and it wiped out Tinian and Saipan. But I was able to, I feel confident that we led the nation through some of the worst disasters: Harvey, Irma, Maria, the California wildfires of 17 and 18, Hurricane Michael, Florence. When you're running FEMA too. This is something about FEMA, Heather, that a lot of people don't realize, is that you're also in charge of making sure that the executive branch of government never fails, regardless of what we face. So you're also in charge of national continuity programs to make sure that the executive branch can continue to function and meet its critical mission, essential functions, regardless of whether we are at war or cyber attacks or whatever happens that impacts the nation. So it's never a dull day at FEMA.
I would say that's an understatement. I didn't realize I didn't even know a fraction of what FEMA actually does. as far as that scope goes, and even the scope global of how vast their services and their opportunities and responsibilities span.
Sadly, since 1979, I often say that FEMA has become the largest insurer on the globe. Essentially, FEMA is, grants a lot of money in the disaster recovery arena. I mean, obviously, their mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. But most of where people see FEMA active is in the recovery side, which has not helped the agency a whole lot. I would like to see the agency being able to engage with people on blue sky days and local governments and state governments more on blue sky days, being involved in the planning, training, and exercise side more so that the relationships are formed after a disaster as much. But largely, FEMA spends, many years, in communities that have been devastated, still administering grants. The problem with that business model is that they've spent too much money focused on uninsured public infrastructure. So if a school system, if public buildings or facilities are uninsured, then FEMA has become, unfortunately, the backstop for state and local governments to fix their uninsured infrastructure, and that's got to change. That needs to be, phased out over time. And state and local communities need to make sure that they have insurance in place, just like a homeowner with a mortgage has to. And the same standard needs to be applied. The other thing is that during my time in office, Heather, I had to ask Congress for more money 3 times because the disaster relief fund ran out of money. You're talking about $15 billion, running
Wow.
out 3 times or more. And if you add up all the recovery dollars that are going to go out to fix the communities that are still fixing the communities today as a result of the 2 years I was in office, it was more money, estimated to be more money than the 9 previous FEMA administrators before me. And part of the problem with that, so that gives you the magnitude of what I faced, or what we faced as an agency, not what I faced, but what we faced at FEMA. And when you look at the ask to Congress provided the money to 30 different federal government agencies to fund 91 different recovery programs. So the system has just continued to be cobbled together, and we go through all these reform efforts. We reformed FEMA after Andrew, after Katrina in 2005, after Sandy hit New York. The DRRA, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, was completed in 2018. It's like we keep strapping shiny parts to a rusty bicycle. Right. And, eventually the agency has had so much put on its plate, and the disaster recovery process has become so complex that no governor understands what they're entitled to, how to sequence all the funding together, use it in a manner that helps them respond, recover, and avoid all of the laws that, would lead them to have that money deobligated years after the project has been completed. So we got to get back to basics in this country, and we have to redraw the swim lanes and the lines that, because I've always said, Heather, that disaster response is a team sport, starting with the citizen all the way to the federal government. So if we're going to continue to reform FEMA and continue to build out federal capability, we're going to woefully miss the mark. And so we've got to get back to some disaster basics on what should be required of American citizens all the way to the federal government.
Yeah, agree. And I think some of too is living in Florida in a space that is frequently impacted. The misconception here is that FEMA is supposed to get you back on your feet and rebuild and do this and do that. And it's like, well, hang on a second. I'm completely with you, to where you also need to take ownership for where you live, to where we do live in an area that's flooded. We do have higher risk, than a lot of different areas. So from that standpoint, for the resident, for the local, what is your advice from that standpoint? What is their responsibility?
Well, I've always thought that our public awareness campaigns are not working. I mean, we have been telling people to do the same thing for 2 or 3 decades at this point, and not addressing the fundamental problem that is seen after disasters always. Okay. So, for example, Hurricane Helene busted up my state of North Carolina. That's where I live and reside now. the first thing that happens is that we ask so many people, like, FEMA would blanket the area, blanket each state, each community, call 1-800-61 FEMA, go to FEMA.gov, register for assistance. The problem with doing that is that a lot of people that will initially think that they should register for assistance get denied by the first phone call because they don't qualify, because they don't understand who should be applying. So the frustration goes through the roof. So if you look at like North Carolina alone, and these numbers change and are dynamic all the time, but I had last heard that over 260,000 registrations were attempted, and over 50,000 were denied by the phone call because they didn't qualify for the assistance based on the type of damage that they had. But the most disturbing number was the number of people uninsured or underinsured. Of all those people that made a phone call, over 160,000 North Carolinians were uninsured or underinsured. And that's not a North Carolina problem. That is a massive Florida problem too.
Right.
That reared its ugly head in Hurricane Irma. So I often joke that we've been telling people to buy supplies for 5 days, which is important because I do believe that, you, the citizen, should be self-sufficient. Trust me, I'm self-sufficient in my household.
I don't question you.
What's that?
I said, I don't question you on that one.
But here's the thing. We're asking people to go buy supplies. Okay, you got poverty, you've got asset poverty. Poverty being, I don't make enough money to make life work. Asset poverty being, I'll make a decent living, but I don't have 3 months worth of savings to my name for whatever reasons. It could be inflation, hardships, who knows? It could be I've never been taught how money works. I'm a big believer in financial resiliency education. We got to increase that. We can come back to that. But if you look at the statistics, 70% of American households do not have 3 months worth of savings to their name, which is a massive problem. Okay. So if 70% of households lie in that, that state, they're not going to the store and buying 5 days worth of supplies and generators and everything else. If you have that type of money, I think the campaign's got to change. That if you have 5 days worth of money to buy supplies or generators, I would rather you take that money and sit down with an insurance agent to make sure you're properly insured. I have never seen anybody starve to death after a disaster in the United States of America, largely because people come together like through the concept of local relief, or we have overgamed the response logistics in this country to where everybody can put their hand on a bottle of water and an MRE. Never seen anybody starve to death, but I've seen hundreds of thousands of people always uninsured or underinsured. And that is the main root of the problem in our disaster response system.
So I hear so many people here, again, in Florida saying, I can't get insurance. I don't, and I don't know if it's they don't try or they whatever this, but as far as someone looking for insurance, because that is a huge frustration here, what is your insight and what is your advice to someone seeking insurance in an area that's prone to disasters?
A majority of Americans can get insurance. They may not like the cost of it, but they can. There are also a large number of people that can't get insured based on where they live and the vulnerability. And that is a big problem too. That's not a problem that FEMA can handle or solve. But Congress, when they're looking at reforming FEMA, has got to come up with some parametric insurance concepts to lower the cost, or how do we have conversations with the reinsurance industry of saying, listen, if the community rebuilds or concentrates the next 5 years on capital improvements, and we bring our community up to a standard or our infrastructure up to a standard, what do we have to do with all this money to get you back to the table to provide accessible insurance, to Florida or to Louisiana or whoever, right? FEMA is caught in the middle of that. I don't think FEMA should be an insurance agent, but technically we are. And like I said, we're the world's largest on the globe because we do flood insurance. And then we're paying for all the uninsured infrastructure of state and local governments, which I think is a moral hazard. I also think what's got to happen is that the states who implement building codes, better land use planning, and ensure their public infrastructure should be rewarded for that type of behavior. So states that are doing the right thing should, in my opinion, should get more money in the education system, more money in the transportation, system, more money for whatever, right? Greater access to government dollars because they are doing the right thing and they are less than a liability. And hopefully the insurance companies start to see that new construction is built to a higher standard in these areas where building codes haven't really been enforced or exist. And, here again, we can talk about reforming FEMA, but until the incentives are put in place for communities to do the right thing, we're never going to be building resilient communities in this country, in my opinion, right?
Right.
So the other unique problem about Florida that was exposed in Hurricane Irma is the number of people moving to Florida from the north or from the west, whatever. And we registered way too many people in Florida for individual assistance when Hurricane Irma hit in 2017. Actually, the number of people, if I remember correctly, that we registered in Florida alone was more than the number of people we registered in California, Texas, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico for all the wildfires, Maria, and everything else. So
Wow.
Florida claims to be a prepared state, but I would argue the latter. And here's why. You have a lot of people who are selling very expensive homes and coming to Florida and paying cash for a house. The problem with that is that they're not putting insurance on that house because there's no mortgage involved. And so we saw a lot of uninsured or underinsured disaster victims in Florida in Irma alone. That's not the only problem. One is access, but here's the other problem. We've concentrated too much on a flood map to determine who should get flood insurance or not. So for anybody listening in, let me tell you this. If you live in an area that it rains, you need to consider flood insurance. Okay? Any house can flood. I don't care what a FEMA flood map says. The maps cannot keep up with the newly built environment. If a Walmart comes into town and changes the floodplain or whatever else, the maps don't keep up. If a community does a terrible job of maintaining their storm drainage ditches, and their drainage systems, the flood maps change. Any house can flood in America. I don't care where you are or where you build. And honestly, insurance is the first line of defense,
Yeah, I would agree. And even, it's interesting you say that with the maps, because here we're in Florida's flat, right? As can be. So you have developments that are building higher. And now where does that water go? But to the developments in the areas that are around that area. So it really does. It changes where, we saw this past year areas flood that have never flooded before. Your residential areas that, and from that standpoint, I totally agree. If you have rain, if you have water, you're at risk. But it's unbelievable of how many things change and shift.
Again, when I say be careful about buying supplies, I mean, you really need to sit down before hurricane season with your policyholder to understand the deductibles and how it changes. Because in Florida, the deductibles change based on the National Hurricane Center naming a new storm. So if there's a named storm, your deductible could go from X amount to 3 times the normal amount. And you'll see where people don't have the money to execute their deductible to be able to activate their insurance. And then the other thing about flood insurance, for example, is it's capped. It's capped at, when I was in office, I think $250,000 is what it pays out. So if you have $1 million home that's been devastated by the flooding, it's not going to cover the whole cost of things. So people, we need more education on insurance. Yeah. We need better initiatives to get insurance companies back to the table. Yeah. And make it more affordable and accessible.
So what would the top 3 things be? Obviously, we could stay here all day and just talk about insurance. But if there were a top 3 where, let's say, someone came to you and said, Brock, I'm getting insurance, I'm looking at flood insurance, what are the top 3 things that I need to look for or ask, or questions I need to ask regarding that policy?
One, understand the types of damage that it actually covers. Define flood, for example. Is that wind-driven rain through a broken window, or is that storm surge? You've got to have these detailed questions and get it in writing and make sure that you understand what's covered in your policy. 2, don't let your insurance lapse, in payment. You've got it. That is one area. Don't try to save money on insurance. If you're going to try to save money on insurance, buy a cheaper car. It's so understand the deductible too. particularly in Florida, and some of these hurricane states, understand that if a named system, if a storm is named, what your deductible becomes after the fact. You also have to understand that when you move to Florida, if there's a named storm out there and you're in the process of buying a home, they're not going to offer you an insurance policy until that storm dissipates and disappears. So you can't get insurance if you're moving, to a state like Florida, coastal states during hurricane. It used to be that you can't even get an insurance policy if there's a named hurricane out lurking in the oceans. That's the other piece too. So main thing is get insured, because insurance is the first line of defense. And here's the thing. When Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in 2017, the average payout of FEMA assistance is about $4,000 to $6,000. If you've lost your home and you're uninsured or underinsured, the average amount of assistance is about $4,000 to $6,000 for that event. The average payout of insurance was $119,000. So the question I would ask every citizen is, do you want FEMA to try to fix you, or would you rather insurance fix you? Huge difference. Insurance is the first line of defense, and I understand all the nuances of I can't get it or it's too expensive. I understand all that.
Yeah.
But it is what it is, right? If you're going to live in Florida, you better be protected.
Yeah.
The other thing I would tell you to do is understand the building codes, particularly if you're buying or selling a home and you're moving, in some states. Understand how the building codes have changed versus when the house was built. 2001 was a very important year in the construction industry in Florida. That's when, some of the most aggressive building codes were put into place. And I will argue that a lot of, construction folks will say building codes, drive up costs. I understand. But I also will tell you that the 2001 Florida building codes that were first put in place, any house that was built after that performs extremely well, for hurricanes, in like the state of Florida where you reside.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the other, I want to explain, or I want to have you explain. I'm not going to explain it. One of the elements that I loved first time I heard you speak was your infamous chair model. So this is so key, especially for people to understand of how everything works together. I think it's fantastic. Can you summarize or talk about that one?
Yeah. I always, when I was in office, tried to help people understand how disaster response works. I've always said it was a team sport. I've always said that disasters are locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. The problem with the way that FEMA has evolved over time, and Congress has looked at FEMA, or citizens look at FEMA, is they look at FEMA as the nation's 911. If FEMA has got to be the nation's 911 for a disaster, it's never going to go well. Okay, we've already seen that in Andrew in South Florida. We saw it again in Katrina in 2005, where the state and local response was broken. It was not strong. And there was this cry for more federal resources. Anytime we're at that point, the system, and nobody's going to be happy, right? If FEMA, but the problem with the reform that we've seen is that it's all been focused on how do we reform FEMA rather than how do we reform education at the citizen level? How do we make sure that the state and local governments take their emergency management capability, seriously? I mean, some of these states, have fewer than 100 people at the state level that do emergency management. FEMA has 21,000, okay, or more. So I always tried to put this together in a visual, and I've always said that proper disaster preparedness, response, and recovery is like a chair with four legs. That seat, that seat of that chair is the nation. That is our nation. That's America, or that's the state of Florida, right? The four legs represent different things. The first leg is a true culture of preparedness within our citizenry that as well as I do, Heather, that it does not exist. Okay.
Right.
You can graduate the most prestigious universities in this country and still not know how to do CPR, invest $1 in the stock market towards your retirement, or understand remotely how insurance actually works, or a mortgage for that fact. So the tangible skills within our citizenry, I would argue, are lacking, and they're continuing to lack with the introduction of Google and AI making everyone an instant genius when they need to be. Okay. So in my opinion, leg one is citizens need to start realizing that they are the true first responder for any event. If I am playing basketball in a church league or whatever, and I roll over and I break my ankle, the people around me are the true first responder. The actions that they take to help me is what I need until the official first responder can arrive, which is police or fire or EMS, right? It's the same in a disaster. Neighbor helping neighbor is the first aspect of what you're trying to solve with local relief, is the first and most important aspect. But start to look around and question, do my neighbors actually have tangible skills? Could they save my life from doing CPR to the Heimlich to how are they really going to help me in a disaster? Right? No offense, but I don't think too many of my neighbors actually have tangible skills these days.
Right.
And
Mine, I think, would definitely bring me a cocktail. Yeah, mine would be like, here
exactly.
you go.
Sorry about your luck. Here's a 6-pack. Which helps. That's fine. But
right.
But think about it. Look in the mirror and ask, what tangible skills do you actually bring to the table to help everybody when the world's into crashing around you, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that that first leg of the chair, we've got to rewrite. Like, how do we do financial education? How do we help people understand how money works, how to save money, how to break negative cycles with money, how to break out of poverty, how to, that's way more important than shoving calculus down my two boys' throats who don't want anything to do with math, right?
Agree.
The next leg is a strong state and local government. The governor is in charge of disasters for their state. They are the chief executive officer for disasters, not FEMA. It is not my disaster, Governor. It is yours. It is your job to understand what gaps are being experienced at the local level. And then can the state mitigate those gaps, whatever is happening, whether it's BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion to Katrina, whatever it may be, a cyber attack. How does is a governor truly prepared to help local governments overcome the gaps that they are experiencing? And when their capability has been exceeded, they call upon the federal government, and the federal government can marshal resources, whether it's money, teams, equipment, whatever it may be, ultimately down through a governor, ultimately to the local level. That's how incident command works. FEMA never comes in and says, it's our disaster, we're here to manage it, governor, mayor, get out of the way. So it never happens. Strong state and local government. Most emergency management agencies at the state level, when you look at their employees and their capability, it's a drop in the bucket compared to their public safety agency capabilities on the law enforcement side. Some states have tens of thousands of law enforcement officials and a couple hundred emergency managers. All right. The third leg of that chair is the private sector. The private sector owns what I call community lifelines. So I established community lifelines doctrine. We started asking the question of what's got to be working in a community, that if it's not working, then people are dying or life routine is disrupted. Very important question. You can't guess what goes wrong in America anymore, from shootings to cyber attacks and Mother Nature. You can't guess it. But what you can focus on in your community with local leaders and state leaders is what's got to be working. And if it's not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted. So what is that, Heather? That's establishing safety and security. Without safety and security, nothing else matters. That's communications. Who owns those communications? It's not the federal government. That's AT&T. That's Verizon. Who owns the power and fuel in your state? It's not the federal government. It's not the Federal Electricity Management Agency. I don't understand why people think FEMA can rebuild a power grid, right? Who owns the hospital system? It's typically the private sector, a lot of it, right? So the private sector actually owns most of the infrastructure. Like 85% of the infrastructure we depend on is owned by the private sector. Oh, wow. Who owns the farm to table logistical supply chains? It's not FEMA. So why does everybody think that FEMA can just come in and magically make this stuff work, right? So, all of our response plans and our tactics and the preparedness campaigns need to be generated and around that third leg of who owns it. If you own this infrastructure, how can I as government help you never go down? Or how can I help you come back up if you do go down? Why are the public awareness campaigns not driven by the people that actually own the infrastructure so that people can be armed with actually helping them get their infrastructure back on, right?
Right.
The fourth leg is the firepower of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, marshaling all of the funding and the teams and equipment down, once again, down through a governor, ultimately to the local level. All right. Remove one leg of the chair. The chair may still stand, but it becomes pretty stable. That could be an unprepared citizenry, an uninsured citizenry. Who knows? It could be a lackluster government, like we've seen in major disasters that make the news, right, at the
Right.
local and state level. Now remove two of those legs. Bam, that's Katrina, right? Bam, that's Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
Anytime FEMA is the one and only leg of the chair going into the disaster, it never goes well and people are upset and Congress calls for FEMA's head. They're trying to reform an agency without understanding the root cause of the problems.
That absolutely makes sense. It really does. And I think, even there, people lean too heavily on that one, where that's the only one they think of. And as far as organizations go and people that come to your aid and the organizations plural that are still there. And just like you said, when you do injure yourself, your immediate neighbors, the immediate organizations around you locally are the ones that are absolutely going to help.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it comes to the first true responder, look at all the active shooting events that are taking place in our communities. And yet you can still graduate major universities and not know how to do CPR. I mean, we got to stop looking at people as a liability and we've got to start giving them the tangible skills to be in the game. How many people tried to grow food during COVID and failed miserably at doing it? How many high schoolers actually know how to produce, or adults for this matter, actually know how to produce clean water if it's not coming out of your faucet? I mean,
Not many.
right. And the other thing too, with the concept of local relief and what you're doing and providing a platform to help people get the things that they need, initially, and I'm going to do a horrible job of explaining your platform,
It's okay.
But the bottom line is that, a lot of times people will have the equipment they need and have never cracked it open, taken it out of the box to understand how it works. Like a generator. If you have a generator and you haven't cranked that thing in 6 to 8 months or a year, it probably has old bad gas in it or something's wrong. It won't start. And people don't have the tangible skills of simply understanding how to fire that thing up when nobody's around and you need it.
Yeah.
How do you get, engine starter, starter fluid, into the carburetors, whatever, to help that thing crank up and be useful to you. Because a lot of people have $1,000 generator that's just a hunk of junk sitting in their garage that they think they're going to be able to just fire up when use it. And then they don't understand the loads on it. They don't understand. They've never plugged their refrigerator into it to see if it actually can handle it or work or whatever, and that's the problem. It's one thing to amass the equipment and the ability, but it's also the skills and know-how of actually doing things.
And I think too, people move here and it blows my mind of never going through one before, perception versus reality. Like I'll often say, you may be able to prepare, but you're never prepared to recover. From that standpoint, people think, oh, I'll have a couple days without power, or I'll have a couple days without this, or I have food. They never know what to do if you have 3 feet of water in your house. So as far as you mentioned earlier, as far as Alabama goes, let's talk about the perception of maybe there's people think I can do with a power outage versus the reality of how it really goes down and what really happens. Would you know more than anybody, would you please give an insight of how it really happens and what disaster really looks like?
Yeah, well, for Florida, the first thing is that a lot of people don't know how to assess their risk. Like for the state of Florida.
And even it's nationwide. It doesn't have to just be Florida. It can be anyone.
Well, let's just take a hurricane. First of all, most people don't understand how a hurricane is actually going to attack them at their house. Do you live in a storm surge area? If not, what's the building code that your house was built to, and can it withstand certain ranges of wind, right? How do you protect your home? Window and door mitigation, particularly Hurricane Charlie in 2003 or 4, it was 2004, was a lesson in garage door exposure in Florida. I mean, if you had a garage door and your house was in the path of Hurricane Charlie and that garage door was not mitigated, it blew open and the roof came off your house. I mean, I remember fire station after fire station, right? So hurricanes attack different homes and dwellings differently. The main reason that we ask people to evacuate or prepare for hurricanes in most areas is because of storm surge. It's the ocean rising, large, very high in some cases, like into the Tampa Bay area, over 20 some feet. Okay. So what's the base flood elevation of where you walk into your front door versus the storm surge potential of a direct hit into Tampa or Jacksonville, whatever it may be? A lot of people have never thought about that or looked at it and said, okay, this is how I need to be prepared. So understand that, for example, storm surge has the highest potential to cause the most amount of deaths and the most amount of property destruction because it's rising water. But yet hurricanes are defined by wind. So everybody thinks, well, it's the wind and my house is well built. It's new construction. It can handle the winds.
Right.
It has nothing to do with it. Right. So when the power does go out, immediately, immediately it takes time for these things, to come back online. I mean, depending on the magnitude and size of the disaster. I mean, Hurricane Helene, one of the most significant events most recently, impacted not just North Carolina where the news cameras are, it impacted Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, parts of Tennessee and North Carolina. Yeah. Resources to get the power back on are limited. And the human capital capability to be able to get the power back on is also limited, right? And there's a massive, effort underway in multiple states, which means the power could be off in your community a long time. And depending on what grid you live on, are you near a hospital? Are you near education systems? What critical infrastructure do you live near? And if you're not near any of it, well, good luck. The power's probably going to be off for a lot longer than those who live near, on the same grid as hospitals or the Department of Defense bases that are in and around those areas, right?
Right.
The thing about it is that after about 24 hours of the power going off, people start to panic about their food, their medications that have to be refrigerated. So the assessment of your public health and access needs issues, like your medical needs issues, are huge. Like you've got to factor that in. I mean, make sure that if you have insulin that needs to be refrigerated, those types of things. I mean, medications, very important.
Yeah.
Some people have generators, some people don't. The people that do have generators, like I said, learn how that thing works, learn how to maximize its use within your house. Is it enough power? Learn how to alternate refrigeration with other needs. If it's a small generation, those types of things. There's a lot. But in some cases, the power can be out. It's not unheard of that, the power can be out for many weeks as a result of, some of the things that we face. And honestly, as cyber attacks from foreign state actors get better and better and better, they're going to focus on shutting the energy off and disrupting our food sources. So, I think that those are the issues in the future that you really need to be thinking through, is long-term power outages, weeks at a time, and disruption in food capability within your community.
Well, that I promise you, a lot of people are going to be stuck on that one. That is going to be nowhere near if COVID was of a lesson of how many people cannot produce their own food. It's not going to be better when you really don't have access to it. Mm-hmm. So,
yep. Yeah, communication is key too. It's hard to communicate with loved ones. I mean, have communication procedures in place. Look at some of the new walkie-talkie technologies that are out there, or new technologies to be able to communicate when the typical systems are down. I think that Congress has got to have a real discussion. I think the industries are trying to do that, but like if communications are down, depending on what company it may be, there's multiple companies on one cell phone tower. So if one company is going to go up and fix their equipment, can they not just go ahead and fix everybody else's equipment as well while they're up there?
Agreed.
It's not, so in some cases, like the private companies, that hold the keys to our success in the disaster, we need to make sure that, they're also looking at mutual aid to fix each other's stuff so that we're all being helped out in time of disaster. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, agree. It really is about helping your neighbor. It's like that example reminds me of someone shoveling just half of their steps, just for theirs and not doing their neighbors. I think the biggest thing too is we get through this together. At the end of the day, we get through this together. And just like whether it's the four legs of the chair or whether it is your neighbor, coming to assist you, I think that's the biggest piece as well, is that it's not just one organization. We can't just focus on the state or just focus on FEMA or just focus on insurance. It really is, I think that group effort is kind of what, at least like I learn, from you more in particular each time, is the fact that it does take a village,
Yep.
to tackle these.
I would encourage people to invest in generation capability, water filtration capability. Without water, it's funny. A lot of people will buy tons of freeze dried food. It takes a ton of water to turn that food into something edible, unless you just want to concentrate on hard pasta and powder. So so a lot of things. It's like you feel good buying these things, but if you don't know how it all works together, that's a problem too. And but the water filtration piece is really important, in my opinion, because without clean water, then none of the freeze dried food that you may have, is really worth it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's part of the problem as well. Learn how all of this works. The other thing too, like with Hurricane Helene, we were without power for 5 days and not really heavily impacted. There wasn't a whole lot of damage around, but the power system was shot. And I have both gas generators and electric generators. The electric generators are nice in your kitchen because they're silent, but it might give you about a day's worth of capability. And you got to think through, do I have the ability to charge an electric generator? Have you ever set up a solar panel in your yard, and to try to,
Right.
charge your electric generator? I'm going to tell you that, the skies were overcast for 2 or 3 days as Helene was exiting where we were. Nothing charged very quickly. So I was much more dependent based on the weather on my gas generator than the electric generator was even worth it.
Right.
But a gas generator becomes loud and annoying over time too. So those are some of the mental things that go on with the equipment supplies that you have. But I would encourage people, like, don't just buy supplies, learn how to use it in some
Yeah.
cases.
100%. And that is all too common and not only have these supplies, but learn the safety of them. If you don't have an extension cord for your refrigerator, do not bring the generator in your house.
Yeah,
I mean, but
exactly.
when the one thing that I've learned is that through anxiety and when people are nervous and are stressed, they're not thinking clearly. Where you may know on a good day not to bring in your generator in the house when you have a crying kid or when you have who knows what and you're trying to figure everything out, you're not thinking of, hey, you know what? I really shouldn't bring this in the house. Maybe we should find
Mhm.
something else that works or whatever. I know
Yeah.
for us, we have the outdoor kitchen, which a lot of them do, and it's like, okay, that's our refrigerator. We'll plug in. Anything that's super important goes in there. Everything else, lucky for us, we're vegan. Vegetables aren't really going to go bad. But you know, there's so many people. Again, you just have to prepare, and that's the biggest thing is absolutely prepare. So
And honestly, some of the supplies that you're going to find yourself needing if the power's off for a long time, is not on a typical preparedness list. Like, I have gas siphons. I have the ability to suck gas out of my truck to put in my generator if I need it.
oh
You know, so there's a lot that's there, and a lot to it. But then again, you got to understand how to do it. What are the
yeah,
tangible skills again? What are
yeah,
the tangible skills that we collectively bring to the community? And I think that, bottom line, Heather, we've got to get it back to a civil defense mindset, which was also like taking this all the way back to the beginning. When FEMA was first created, it was created with a civil defense mindset. Our National Guards, their mission is warfighting, not disaster relief, even though that's what they've been roped into in the last 2 decades, and they're very good at some of the missions. the bottom line is, at the end of the day, when you look at like National Guard capability, for example, their first priority is war fighting and being deployed and protecting this country. FEMA's initial, the emergency manager's initial mission was taking care of the domestic home front. And I'm afraid that we just don't have that muscle memory anymore, as a nation. And I think that we've got to get back the civil defense aspect, within our citizenry, within our kids, and bring back scouting, in a great way, for people to
Yeah.
learn tangible skills. And if you can't demonstrate certain tangible skills to save somebody else's life, then should you really be accepted into the Ivy League or ACC schools or SEC?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. I don't care how smart you are.
That's very true. Yeah, very true. I taught a class in my first job out of college was teaching, and I taught a class that was mandatory. It was called Skills for the Workplace, and it was great. It was common sense. It was checking accounts. It was resumes, cover letters, that type of stuff. And I think from that standpoint too, from emergencies, I would love to work with you and put some of that content in the app, so we are educating people on what that may be, whether things like the gas siphoning, or whether, the CPR component, or whether it be the information that people truly need. Let's throw that in there.
And that's an important part, like particularly with what you're trying to do with local relief, as I understand it too. People need to understand that when FEMA responds, or government responds to a disaster area, they're not allowed by law or policy to do many things to help people in a manner that they need to be helped. Okay. So people will fall through the cracks when they lose, their home or have significant damage. The federal government's laws are big and bulky, the policies are big and bulky, and it is never designed to make someone whole. The nonprofits, the non-governmental organizations, and the private sector side, like what you're doing with disaster local relief, with local relief, are incredibly important. The neighbor helping neighbor, because you can be as nimble or dynamic as needed to be in the heat of battle to help someone's specific needs, where the federal government, state government, local government can't. And so it is really important for people to also volunteer their time, their materials, their capability, when others are in need, because a lot of times, like I said, FEMA was never designed to make anybody whole after a disaster.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you 100% as far as the volunteering, the helping, the taking ownership, everything you've said. I really do appreciate it. So, but as far as oh my gosh, no, it truly, thank you for joining. And again, this is Heather Hackett with Local Relief Live. I thank Brock Long truly for his insight and information. It's incredibly invaluable, as you see now. But also, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, follow, all that stuff, and download the Local Relief app. So thank you again, and we will see you soon.